college basketball carousel in the next like 10 days is about to go crazy, okay? Because I think like we're all college sports fans, okay? And in college football, the carousel is kind of interesting. Kind of 2-3 weeks out from the end of the regular season, you kind of know who's probably going to get fired. And what's happened more and more in football is that you fire a guy 3-4 weeks out because you have to have a guy in place the second the transfer portal opens, not only to get new players, but to retain your own. College basketball doesn't quite work like that. Most coaches, except at Ohio State, get until the end of the season to kind of finish things out. But once those conference tournaments end, that's where the movement happens, and it happens really quick. And so with that said, Louisville is the job that, listen, we all know it's going to open. It's been weird. It's been bad. By the way, there was a weird thing in Louisville this week where they were hosting recruits. My buddy Nick Coffey was going off like, what are we doing? Why are you even allowing the staff to host a recruit when we know that Kenny Payne and his staff will probably be fired as early as next Tuesday when the ACC tournament opens? So Kenny Payne's going to be out. And about 3 or 4 weeks ago, we did our first real look at the job. What's kind of interesting about it is that 2-3 weeks ago, a lot of the candidates that seemed at the forefront have kind of fallen back, have had disappointing years. Chris Beard was at the top of the list. Ole Miss is struggling. They're going to miss the NCAA tournament. Eric Musselman was at the top of the list. Arkansas is struggling. Now, he's got a little bit more sweat equity built at Arkansas, but it's been a disappointing year. Jerome Tang, Kansas State, it's been a disappointing year. So a lot of the names that we thought were candidates don't feel as strong as they were, 5-6 weeks ago. Well, I bring it up because I saw an interesting report out of Louisville that there may be a new name worth kind of keeping your eye on going forward with this job. That name, it is Baylor coach Scott Drew. Has Scott Drew emerged as the favorite for this job? And so I want to give credit because I saw this come out of a Louisville radio station. Drew Diener, who hosts radio down there, he said this on his show on Wednesday afternoon, talking about the Louisville job opening. ESPN Radio said this. He said, Scott Drew is the number one target for Louisville. They are down to the point, though, where they need an answer soon. That's who they want. The job is his if he wants it. That's how I would put it. But they've got to get an answer soon. They can't wait around for him to make a decision in April. I don't know who the number 2 is, but there's a clear number 2 that they think is highly gettable. Nothing's a done deal, but a guy that they absolutely feel like if they can't get Drew, they can get this guy, and they want this guy. That's where they are. All right, so Louisville reporter says that Scott Drew is the favorite. And let me just say this. I think it's interesting. It's not something that I have necessarily heard as him being the definitive favorite, but do I think it's out of the realm of possibility? I don't. First off, a couple things on Louisville. One, and I said this the last time we did the update, the good news for Louisville, the quality of candidate that they are going to have the opportunity to get here over the next couple weeks, whoever it is, Scott Drew, somebody else, it is going to be better than it was the last coaching cycle. Remember, last coaching cycle, you fire Chris Mack midseason. He didn't get fired. He actually quit. But Chris Mack leaves midseason. You're in the middle of an NCAA investigation. Chris Mack has his own investigation with the Dino Gaudio stuff. You don't really know what's going on. And so I don't think any of those big names were ever really interested in taking the job. Well, this year, I think you're going to get somebody more high profile. And I'll say this about Scott Drew. I do think he fits the number one criteria beyond anything else is it a guy that can ultimately win the press conference at Louisville? Okay. Because to me, that's the most important thing. I'm not criticizing Louisville fans, but it is a divided fan base right now. And you can't bring in somebody that half the fan base doesn't believe in from the beginning. So I think he kind of has that, press conference vibe where it's going to win the press conference. I do think that's important. And I do think there are a couple reasons why it would make sense for Scott Drew to consider the job. One, first of all, he's really accomplished. So again, that helps win the press conference, right? Has won a national championship. That's kind of a big deal. And to his credit, we're talking about a program at Baylor that has really been really kind of in that top 10 to 12 teams in the country for about 5 or 6 years now. 2021 was the peak, but 2020, they were good enough to win a national championship before the tournament was shut down. This year, they're going to get a 2 or 3 seed. Last year, they had a pretty high seed. The year before, they were good. Won a championship in 2021. So he has the credibility. And two, I do wonder if he's ever going to leave Baylor, if this does kind of feel like the time. One, it ain't going to get any better at Baylor than winning a championship in 2021. And as a matter of fact, it's only going to get harder going forward. First off, respect to Baylor, respect with what he's done. He has done an unbelievable job in building that program. But at the end of the day, let's call a spade a spade. Baylor is not Kansas. And so essentially, even before all the expansion, basically everything has to break right. Otherwise, Kansas has advantages that Baylor simply doesn't. By the way, so does Louisville. So does Kentucky. So does Kansas. So does UCLA. So there are certain jobs that it's just the standards are higher, but it's more realistic to meet those expectations. It is hard to win at Baylor, okay? And it is not going to get any easier as the Big 12 expands. We talk so much about realignment from a football perspective. You understand how tough the Big 12 has gotten in basketball? Kansas is humming. Iowa State is at a really high level. Kansas State has been a pretty consistent program the last 15 years. Now you're adding Houston. Well, Houston just walked in year one and is kicking butt and taking names. As long as Kelvin Sampson's there, they're not taking a step back. Arizona is coming in next year. That is another team that is built to have more success on a year in, year out basis than Baylor. It's just the truth. You don't have to like it. It's a fact, though. So you look at that, and I sit there and say, has Baylor as a program kind of capped? I remember during football season, I said, I don't think there's a bigger loser in football realignment than Penn State. Because Penn State was very clearly the number 3 team in the Big Ten, and you hope that maybe Harbaugh would leave or maybe Ryan Day would leave. You could get to number 2 or number 1. Well, now you still got Ohio State, you still got Michigan. But if you're Penn State, you have USC, you have Oregon, you have Washington, etc. And I kind of feel like the same with Baylor. You were the number 2, but some years you were better than Kansas and da-da-da-da. Now you got to be better than Kansas and Arizona and Houston. And you got to hope that Texas Tech doesn't figure things out and that Kansas State doesn't figure things out and that Iowa doesn't keep things rolling. Iowa State, doesn't keep things rolling. It's just becoming a harder place to win. And so I think if you're Scott Drew, you look at that. You look at the fact that he's 53 years old. And it does kind of feel like if there's ever a year, if there's ever a time that he is going to step away, now kind of feels like the time, doesn't it? He's 53 years old. He's probably got about 10 to 12 really good years left. Coaches are retiring in their early to mid 60s. And it's like, do you want to remain at Baylor forever where you're beating your head up against the wall? I know you got the new facility. I know it's a good job, but it ain't, again, the Kansas, Kentucky, Louisville, Arizona type job. And do you want to take one more run at a place like that? I think it's at least worth considering if you're Scott Drew. Now, I think from the Louisville perspective, it's interesting because a couple things. First of all, I want to backtrack to some of the comments because they did say they're down to the point, though, where they need an answer soon. That's who they want. The job is his if he wants it. I think that's another thing, too, I didn't mention, by the way. It appears as though Scott Drew is at least willing to listen to other offers. We know that very publicly it appears as though he is the favorite to replace John Calipari when John Calipari leaves Kentucky. So I don't think Scott Drew is leaving Baylor for nowhere. But I do think the right job could get him to listen. And so I think it becomes an interesting thing of if he listens. Now, this part was interesting. The part where Drew Diener said they are down to the point, though, where they need an answer soon. That's who they want. The job is his if he wants it. That's how I would put it. But they've got to have an answer soon. They can't wait around for him to make a decision in April. What I think he means by that, and I don't want to quote him, but I think what he means by that is essentially that basically, like, we're kind of at the point where Louisville kind of needs to know, okay, like, we're not asking you to leave Baylor in the middle of the season to take the job. But if we fire Kenny Payne, when we fire Kenny Payne, are you going to take this thing? Because the one thing that Louisville cannot afford to happen, and I defend Louisville on this, I think they're right. They can't fire Kenny Payne next Tuesday, wait 2 weeks for UCLA or for Baylor's season to end, and then and then not hire anyone, assuming that Scott Drew is going to take the job. And so, what this really comes down to is, do you know that he is going to say yes? And I think that's kind of the point. If you don't, they have to move on. Now, the stuff about waiting till April, whatever, that would only apply if Scott Drew made the Final Four. And if he does, I don't think he's going anywhere. But it does kind of feel like he's hit the ceiling there. And I do think it'd be a good hire for Louisville. Listen, I think there are other guys that are interesting, but everybody's got something, right? You know, Chris Beard obviously has off the court issues. Jerome Tang, Eric Musselman, as I said, are struggling this year. So I think Scott Drew would be good. I think it's interesting. I think the thing for Scott Drew, he has kept the program at a really high level, even post that 2021 championship. Because I'm one of those guys that was like, well, everything broke right. You had 2 or 3 guys that were ready to declare for the draft. Because of COVID, they come back. You steamroll everybody to win a national championship. But I think Scott Drew would be really good there. And especially in a down ACC, I could see him having success early. Really quickly, I thought the second part of that conversation was interesting as well. The part where they said, I don't know who the number 2 is, but there's a clear number 2 that they think has high gettability. It's an interesting point. Couple thoughts here. One, I still hear a lot of Mick Cronin buzz. And what I will tell you, listen, I've been making phone calls last month, all off the record. And like what I would tell you with Mick Cronin, you hear stuff about whatever, but at the end of the day, he does still have like a $16 million buyout. And I think Mick Cronin would love to get that buyout brought down. And I think if it could, he would absolutely want the Louisville job. I think if he could just take the Louisville job with no strings attached, I think he'd probably take it. But I can't see UCLA, an athletic department that does not have very much money right now, even with the Big Ten. Remember, they still owe hundreds of millions of dollars. And oh, by the way, remember, they have to give Cal some of their money because they're part of the same school system. So UCLA doesn't have as much money as you'd think. And I just can't imagine just letting Mick Cronin walk for $16 million or something like that. So I'll believe that Mick Cronin is the legitimate number 2 candidate when I see it. Also worth noting, by the way, I think it's much more likely that that number 2 candidate is maybe either an Eric Musselman or a Jerome Tang. Both those guys have pretty easy buyouts to get out of. And so you're not talking about a Mick Cronin and Nate Oates that has a $10, $12, $15 million buyout.